Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
I might have to take off my jacket any minute. My name is Ann, and I'm an alcoholic. And I want to congratulate the CHIP people and wish David and Lee a happy birthday, and tell Kay, you look so put together. I don't look that put together now. I mean, and I love your hair, you know. I couldn't even comb my hair for the first 6 months. So anyway, congratulations. And I want to thank Terry for inviting me to come here and share with you tonight. Thank you, Terry. I don't know how you got my name or what I'm doing here, but here I am. And you know, I'm here because I'm an alcoholic, and I want to start by saying that what I say up here is my opinion based upon the big book of, based upon my experience with the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, specifically the first 164 pages and the 12 and 12, and I owe so much to Bill W., and I owe my life to God, to a loving God, totally to God, and to Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been going through a pretty bumpy period in my sobriety of late, and you know, it began, I was leaving to speak for a meeting about the middle of May, and I was going out the door, and my mom called, and my stepbrother had been in an accident. He had fallen off his tractor, he had broken his neck, he was paralyzed from the neck down, and they didn't know if he would live. And I remember I drove to that meeting to speak, and I got there a minute, the poor secretary was dying, I got there a minute before I was supposed to speak, and I don't remember a word I said, and I had to speak for about the same amount of time I'm speaking tonight, and so hopefully I'll be a little more coherent tonight, although there's no guarantee. I'm happy to report that today my stepbrother, who wanted to kill himself for the first few weeks after that accident, is now in a wheelchair. He has some hand movement, and the best part of all is he really wants to live, and he really wants to help other people that are going through the same experience. And a couple of weeks after that, I went to see the doctor, and I was told that I could have cancer, and went through a pretty rocky couple of weeks waiting for the results, and the good news, and I spoke at Jean's meeting the day that I would, you know, I have an experience of the days that I speak, bad things seem to happen, and I'm happy to report that today I had a really good day and I got no bad news, okay? But I do not have cancer, thank you God. I do have to have surgery in a few weeks that I'm not looking forward to, and but I'll deal with it when it comes, as I do everything in Alcoholics Anonymous, a day at a time. So here we are, and let me, what time do I stop, Terry? 8:25. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on what it was like, because you all know what it was like. But just to give you a little bit about my background, I come from a long line of alcoholics. My mother's father died of this disease before he was 50 years old. We don't exactly know the circumstances of his death. We do know that it was alcohol related. He had by that time left my grandmother and was living on the streets, but he died of alcoholism. And my father met my mother in a blackout and didn't remember meeting her, he was home on leave during the war, the Second World War, I'll tell you the truth. It was the Second World War, and he came to the next day and had written her phone number in a matchbook and asked his buddy whose number that was, and his friend said she was a really hot redhead, he ought to give her a call, so he did, and the rest is history. So their courtship was one of those typical alcoholic courtships where, you know, he came home on leave, they went out on weekends, and he was a great catch on paper. He was a Harvard graduate. He had been a football player at Harvard. He was a captain in the Army. My grandmother told my mother she should marry him, and so she did. And he went back to fight the war, and I was born, and then the war ended, and he came home, and that's when my mother really realized what an alcoholic he was. They moved in with his parents, and, you know, his drinking, he was an alcoholic. My father had his last drink when he was 37 years old. He has never had a drink since without this program. And, but he is sober today. My mother, on the other hand, doesn't think she's an alcoholic. I would never tell her she was an alcoholic. It's not my place to tell her. And the reason she doesn't think she's an alcoholic is because she has never had a drink before 4:30 in the afternoon. Now, from 4:30 in the afternoon on is another story. And my daughter and I just went, my mother and my stepfather live in Eugene, Oregon, and my daughter and I just flew up there at the beginning of May to celebrate my mother's 80th birthday. And, you know, God bless her, but she's 80 years old, and she was blitzed every night, and, you know, and it's none of my business, okay? And so my parents divorced when I was 3 years old. I'm an only child, and because they were living with his parents when my mother left him, she went to live with my grandmother, who was living in Arizona because she had sinus problems and needed the dry heat. And so I was taken across the country away from my father to live with my grandmother and my mother. And that affected me my entire childhood. It affects me to this day because I grew up feeling like my father had abandoned me, even though my mother was the one that left, because I only saw my father probably 5 times in my entire life until I had been sober about 5 years, and I went back to Boston where he lives and made a living amends to him, because one of the things I did to retaliate for his abandonment was he would, you know, send child support. He would send me birthday cards. He would send me checks and presents and whatever. And as I became an adult, I just refused to acknowledge them. You know, it was like payback. And so I grew up a very lonely child. The teachers and the counselors always used to say that Anne was very emotionally insecure. From the earliest that I can remember, I felt very different. I felt very separate and apart from. I didn't have many playmates. I lived in the company of adults. My mother was emotionally unstable. She remarried when I was 8 years old. She remarried another practicing alcoholic who kited bad checks, and when he was busted by the feds, she fell apart. And I was awakened one night by the police when I was 8 years old, and they were carrying my mother out on a stretcher, and there was blood everywhere, and her wrists were bandaged, and I was taken to a foster home. And when I was put in that foster home, those were the happiest weeks of my life. I was finally in the family that I always wanted. There was a mom, there was a dad, there were brothers, there were sisters. They weren't my blood relatives, but it was that family that I thought everyone else had, and that being there, it made me feel secure and safe. And I was only there for a few weeks, and then I was put in a Catholic boarding school because my mother simply couldn't cope with a young child. And I'm not Catholic, So in the Catholic boarding school, it was just one more time and one more place for me to feel separate and different then. Basically, what I was hearing every day in school from the nuns was that because I wasn't Catholic, I was going to go to hell. So it was sort of like I was doomed from the gate. And as I got older, my retreats were books, television, and, you know, I lived in my own little world. And I went through high school, again, a pretty lonely kid, and did not drink in high school. And I'll tell you why I didn't drink. It was because I never wanted to be like my parents. I never wanted to be like my mother, who would come home from work every day and pour herself. The very first thing she would do when she got in the door, when she set down her purse, was go into the kitchen. I could hear the ice go into the glass, and it was a tumbler, and the vodka go over the ice, and then she would, and that would be her evening, and I never, ever wanted to be like that. But the night that I graduated from high school, everybody was drinking before we went to the grad night party, and so before they came to pick me up, I did what I'd always seen my mother do. I walked into the kitchen, I took out the tumbler, I skipped the ice. I just poured the vodka into the glass about halfway up, and I chugged until the glass was empty. And that basically describes the way that I drank until I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. I never took a social drink. I wasn't one of those people that segued from social drinking into alcoholism. I believe that I was born an alcoholic. I believe that I have a physical allergy to alcohol, and that when I put it into my body, and the big book tells me this, but it's my experience, that I want more, and that I drink for the effect produced by alcohol. I'm not drinking it because it tastes good. Frankly, there are very few drinks I ever like the taste of. Even those, I mean, truthfully, I like those tropical drinks, you know, but I really wish they'd cut back on the fruit juice and just given me more of the booze, you know what I'm saying? So that was my first drink, that grad night. And I remember the feeling going down, and the feeling was warm. I felt warm inside. I felt safe inside. I felt comfortable in my own skin. I know you've heard this many times, but that's exactly the way I felt. And when I went to that grad night party, it didn't matter that I had adolescent acne and that I was 20 pounds overweight or anything else. I thought I was gorgeous, and I could talk to anybody, and I was comfortable for the first time in my life. And my mother needed to move to Southern California at that time when I graduated, right after I graduated from high school, because that's where her work was. And we moved to Southern California. I just lost my train of thought because I saw one of the women I sponsor walk in, and it just totally, I lost it. But I think I'm in Southern California now. And I went away to college. I went to Cal State Northridge, and when I was out at Cal State Northridge, I fell in love, and I was dating this guy, and I fell in love, and he broke up with me, and he broke up with me because I was a virgin. Now, during this time that I was at college, we would have the keg parties, the beer parties, and again, every time that I drank, it was chug, and I was the one that threw up, passed out, didn't remember what happened, you know, the one they had to carry home, the one they put in the backseat of the car and drove around. I was not a pretty drunk. And so this guy broke up with me because I was a virgin, and I was determined that that wouldn't happen with the next guy, okay? And so it didn't, and I ended up pregnant. And he said he would marry me if that ever happened, but he didn't. And I ended up, this was back in the days when abortion was illegal, And my mother had then remarried husband number 3, and he was a very, very high up in the aeronautics and space industry. And they didn't want the neighbors to know, so they put me in a home for unwed mothers, and I gave birth to my daughter there. And I was going to give her up for adoption, and the man that was the father came and begged me not to do that and wanted to do the right thing and wanted to get married, and I wanted to keep my child. And so I married him for all the wrong reasons. And we set up housekeeping in South San Gabriel, not having a clue. Everything I knew about raising a child, I learned from my mother, which was not a good example, or from Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. And I was one of those women that would get up in the morning, my hand to God, put on pearls and a dress and a frilly apron to make breakfast because I'd seen it on Father Knows Best. And I didn't have a clue. And it was around this time that, you know, he was working a great deal, and we had another child, a son, and I started, you know, the doctor was giving me funny little pills to calm me down, and I started augmenting this with alcohol, and my husband became more and more, he was emotionally abusive, he became physically abusive, and he became progressively more physically abusive, and we moved to Huntington Beach in Orange County, and by now I was drinking quite a bit. I mean, by quite a bit, I mean whenever he wasn't around. When we went to weddings, again, it was the typical, I drank until I passed out and had to be put in the car so the wedding could continue without me because I would disrupt the event. But it was, the kind of drinking I did was a lot of when he wasn't home. You know, it was the delicious stuff like Spinata and Bally High, and but you could get a lot of it for very little money, and we were on a budget after all. But his abuse got to the point where one night he beat me pretty seriously to the point where I suffered a brain concussion and I had to be hospitalized, and a psychiatrist visited me and suggested that I was in the throes of a nervous breakdown and put me in a psychiatric hospital. And it was during the course of time that I was in there that I decided to leave my husband. And because I didn't have any living skills, I was moved into a halfway house from the psychiatric hospital, and it was there that I really learned how to drink and use, because in the halfway house there were a lot of ex-convicts. There were, you know, I learned a great deal about how to drink and use. And when I left there and I got the first job I'd ever had in my life when I was 27 years old, I was really emotionally and mentally unequipped to deal with taking care of my children. And I was also starting to drink very heavily, augmented by a lot of prescription drugs. And so I made the decision to give up custody of my children to my husband. And I spent the next decade drinking and using behind that decision, because I felt that a decent woman, that a good woman, that it just validated everything that I ever felt about myself, that I, the mother of these children, would give them away to their father. And I was the kind of mother, I had weekend visitation with my children, and I was to pick them up every Saturday and bring them back on Sunday. And as my alcoholism progressed, I rarely ever showed up to pick them up. And my son still tells stories of how he used to wait on the curb for me, and I didn't show up, and I didn't call, and I wasn't there, and that's the kind of mother I was. And I drank to push down the way I felt about myself for that. When I would go to be with them, the pain was so great over what I had done that I couldn't deal with it. And so my choice was just to not go see them. It felt to me at the time like the least painful way. But my son, God bless him, he adored me no matter what. My daughter, my ex-husband remarried a year after, not even a year after our divorce, actually 3 weeks after our divorce was final, and she made her stepmother her ally, and I don't blame her for a minute, but my son never stopped loving me, and he was the child that when he was 14 years old and I picked him up one weekend, and by then my alcoholism had progressed to the point where I was drinking on a daily basis, where I was getting up in the morning and drinking, where I was drinking around the clock, where I was augmenting it with NyQuil, where, you know, I was doing the various trips to the liquor store. I was in pretty bad straits, and I was 36 years old, and I took him out one night to the Scotch and Sirloin. It used to be the Scotch and Sirloin over on Pico and Sepulveda. That's where I used to take him so I could drink and he could play Pac-Man, and I'd give him a roll of quarters, and it was good for the night. And when they closed down at 2 a.m., we were walking out to the car. He was walking, I was staggering, and he looked up at me and he said, "Mom, I was so ashamed of you in there." And that was my moment of clarity. The look in his eyes. And when I drove him back home, actually I didn't drive him back home the next day. For some reason, I didn't drink anymore that night, but I couldn't get sober. I was literally drunk when I drove him home, even though it was probably 12 to 14 hours after I'd had my last drink. And when I got back home to my apartment in Brentwood, it was a Monday morning, and for some reason I thought maybe I should call Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I didn't know anybody that went to Alcoholics Anonymous. The only time I'd ever heard of Alcoholics Anonymous was in the film The Days of Wine and Roses. I don't know why it occurred to me to call Alcoholics Anonymous, and I for some reason picked up the phone book and looked in the phone book under A, and there it was, Alcoholics Anonymous. So I called the number, and I said to the man that answered the phone, "I think I have a drinking problem." And he said, "Stay by the phone, I'll have someone call you." And he had a woman call me about 5 minutes later, and her name was Connell, and she said, "Can you stay sober until I come to pick you up for a meeting tonight?" And you know, that was a tall order. I hadn't had a drink yet that day, but it was hard to stay sober waiting for her to come and pick me up. But I did, and she took me to a meeting. She took me up to a meeting. This was in April of 1982. She took me up to a step study in Bel Air on Mulholland Drive. She picked me up in a Mercedes. This was not what I thought Alcoholics Anonymous would be like. She took me, you know, the typical story, I expected to walk into a room of low-bottom losers in raincoats, and I walked into this room of people that looked just like you do. You know, their eyes were clear, they were cleaned up, they were like, and then they started to share. The speaker that night, the leader was a woman named Molly B., and she told her story, and I was riveted. It was the first time in my life where I was in a room full of people where I felt like I belonged. And I so identified with her. But the thing that I had the really hard time with was at the end of the meeting when we all got up and we held hands and said the Lord's Prayer. And in that moment I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to do Alcoholics Anonymous because I don't believe in God. This whole deal, I can't do this. And it's just like it sent my spirits like. And Connell somehow knew, and she pulled me aside after the meeting and she said, "You know, all this God stuff, you don't have to like deal with that right now. You can just make the group your higher power and just like take it as it comes." And I was so relieved when she told me that. And that's what kept me coming back to these rooms, knowing that I didn't have to immediately adopt somebody else's idea of God or even God. And for the beginning, the group was my higher power, and that was the case for a very long time. I was one of those pink cloud people when I first got sober. I loved Alcoholics Anonymous. I went to 2 meetings a day until they told me I had to get a job and be self-supporting through my own contributions. Then I would go to work, go to a meeting, go to work, go to a meeting. I did that for my first 5 years of sobriety. I had a commitment at every single meeting. I began to sponsor. I began to lead meetings. I was very involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. Around 8 years of sobriety, somehow I felt that, and along the way, I developed a concept of God. This was the God that found me jobs, that found me parking spaces, that gave me all the stuff. At 8 years of sobriety, I decided it was time to meet him, a normal man who had all the right credentials, and I did. And as I became involved in that relationship, what began to happen without my even realizing it is that sobriety, which had always been my #1 priority, began to take, now don't get me wrong, it wasn't like it happened like that. It happened over many years. It was a long, slow thing that happened. He gave me a big AA party for my 10th AA birthday. We were still together on my 12th AA birthday. I was going to a lot less meetings. We had a home in Pebble Beach. We had a home in Los Angeles. I could be invisible because I was living in the valley where I hadn't gotten sober. We were living in Pebble Beach, so it was a 50-50 deal. So I was going to meetings and I was sitting in a chair, but I wasn't talking about what was going on. I slowly began to feel like it was more important to look good than talk about what was going on, because after all, I had over 12 years of sobriety, and it was my job to be a program of attraction. I don't know what I was thinking. The idea that my length of sobriety was it, and that was what was keeping me sober. And so around 12 and a half years of sobriety, when I had serious back problems, bulging disc and spinal stenosis, and the doctor suggested Vicodin, because I'd been sober 12 and a half years and it hadn't been invented when I first got sober, I took it. And around 13 years and 10 months of sobriety, when the relationship was not going well, and I was beginning to feel like still going to meetings. I was still going to meetings, but I was beginning to look for the differences instead of the similarities. And I was beginning to feel like you people, you were the alcoholics. But like I had been sober all these years, and I probably had just had a drinking problem, and it was a phase I was going through. And everything that it says in chapter 3, more about alcoholism, was me. Okay, I went through all of those mental flip-flops that led me to the point where at 13 years and 10 months, when the relationship was going well, and we were at the house in Pebble Beach, I remembered the sake that was, I was married to living with a normie, so we had alcohol in the house, and I never touched it, and it was never a problem. But in the Pebble Beach, 500 miles from the Los Angeles house, I remembered this sake that his youngest son had brought back from Japan, and in Japan they have it in little cans. And I remember there were some cans in the refrigerator, and I had the mental obsession. It was on me, and the mental obsession was, if that sake is in the refrigerator when we get back to Los Angeles, I'm going to have a drink. So for 500 miles back on that drive, I thought about that sake, to the point where I was literally salivating, and I mean, I was in the mental obsession. Didn't occur to me to make a phone call, didn't occur to me to go to a meeting. I was hell-bent. And my plan was, if it was there when I got back, I'd take a drink, nobody would ever know, and that would be that. We pull into the garage, the engine isn't even off on the car. I'm out of the car, I'm in the house, I've got the refrigerator open, 4 cans of sake. I grab one, I run into the downstairs bathroom. It is down my throat because you know how I drink. It's down, okay? And then, why not? Okay, I've already had the drink. what a relief. I mean, I just felt like, you know, because I was dry, okay? I wasn't in recovery, and I hadn't been in recovery for 2 to 3 years before I took that drink. So you put alcohol into a dry drunk, and man, I'm off to the races. I had those other 3 cans down in an hour, and when I went to the grocery store, and when I woke up the next morning, it was, I wasn't, okay, did that, but I'm at the grocery store, and I'm going down the same liquor aisle, you know, I've always gone on, and they have this 64-ounce bottle of sake. So my head says, I'll quit tomorrow. You know, I'll quit tomorrow. And I'm right back to where I was almost 14 years before. And this is how it went. And I couldn't let the guy I was living with know I was drinking. He thought he was living with a sober alcoholic woman. So, I mean, it was the hide the empties in the trunk of the car, clang, 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 find a dumpster, ditch the empties, go to the liquor store, go to that liquor store. It was like, and finally what I did was I had enough alcohol in me to just tell this guy to basically that I was just leaving, okay? And I left, and I moved back over the hill to Venice, and I moved in with a sober alcoholic. And now my 14th AA birthday was here, and what can I tell you? I couldn't tell anyone I was drinking. And my son wanted to give me my cake. Now my son, part of my story is my son came back to live with me when I was a year sober. And as a result of that, he ended up, I put him in a rehab. He got sober when he was 18. By the time I took that drink in the spring of 1996, he was 11 years sober. And he wanted to give me a cake at a meeting. So I couldn't tell him I was drinking, so I took a cake at a meeting. And another friend wanted to give me a cake at a meeting, so I took a cake at a meeting. I took a cake for 14 years of sobriety at a meeting, and my justification for doing that was that I didn't have a drink that day. Okay, so that made it okay. And what ended up happening was I was living with this sober woman, and I was smuggling Kahlua and vodka. I had to figure out a way to make it look like Diet Coke. So my solution was half Kahlua, half vodka. Shake it up, and I would walk around her house, the sober alcoholics woman's house, drinking this Diet Coke. She thought I was acting a little funny. And so one day when I left, she went to her neighbor with the bottle, and she said, "Can you taste this for me?" Because she was a sober alcoholic. And her neighbor took one swig and said, "Whoa, where'd you get this? Ann's been drinking this." You know, so she called my sponsor. I got home that evening. I sat down to eat dinner, and she said to me, "How long have you been drinking?" And I was so relieved to be able to tell the truth. You have no idea. I spilled my guts, and called my sponsor, called my son. You know how it gets around in AA. I knew the minute I raised my hand as a newcomer, because my sponsor said I had to go to the meeting the next day and raise my hand as a newcomer, to let him know I would be doing that. And the next day I went to a meeting, and my son's sponsor was speaking at that meeting. And I came in, and he just looked at me like, "You're back." You know, I mean, he knew. And it was so hard for me my ego, the kind of ego that tells me I can take a drink at 13 years and 10 months of sobriety, and now I've got to come into rooms with people that I got sober with women that I sponsored, and I've got to raise my hand as a newcomer. It was so painful, but I did it. And I did things like I took 30-day chips at every meeting I went to when I got 30 days. And I took 60-day chips. And I want to tell you, the hardest thing I've ever had to do was getting sober again, because so much of it was about my ego. And I really got that. And I really got that what I really needed to do was get into what those first 164 pages of the book was talking about. Because I knew that if I drank again, the alternatives were insanity, death, or jail. And so I began to really get involved in working the steps and learning about the steps. What I didn't tell you was that first morning that I had to go to that meeting that night, I had never ever done this before. I rolled out of bed and I got down on my knees and I said, God, if you are there and you do exist, you have to give me a sign, and you have to give me a sign right now, because I can't do this alone. And I felt these hands on my shoulder. The sun hadn't even come up yet. And I knew that it was God. And that was the first real spiritual experience I had ever had. And that experience carried me through those first very, very difficult 6 to 9 months of getting sober again. And a lot of things have happened to me. That was my new sobriety date is December 1st, 1996. And so much has happened to me in the last 5.5 years. There is no doubt in my mind that I am sober solely by the grace of a loving God. That I got sober once is a miracle. That I got sober again is an even greater miracle. That, you know, what has happened to me in this sobriety is I have watched, you know, the things in my life, my son marrying and giving me 2 beautiful grandchildren, a grandson. I was there for his birth, and he is now 4. I have a 15-month-old new granddaughter, that daughter who had basically wouldn't have anything to do with me. When I got sober this time, we began to work on our relationship, and that child is the daughter that went up with me to Oregon to my mother's 80th birthday, and she and I have the most incredible relationship, and she tells me she's so glad that I'm her mom. And but the mother that I am today is solely and directly a result of Alcoholics Anonymous, because it was in these rooms that I learned how to be a mother. It was through these steps. You know, there isn't a step 1 through 12 that cannot solve any problem in my life. It's as simple as that. Whatever the problem is, those steps are there to help me out. You know, the big book tells us that our greatest calamity will become our greatest asset. And for me, my greatest calamity was drinking again with that amount of sobriety. And I didn't think I would ever, you know, feel that could be a benefit to anybody. And it has become my greatest asset, because today I get to work with women who go out after long-term sobriety. And I get to share at meetings about what happens when one becomes complacent about sobriety and begins to think that if I begin to think that because I'm sober X number of years, that somehow I can take a drink, when the big book tells me that all I have is a daily reprieve dependent upon the maintenance of my spiritual condition, you know, then my humility's gone out the window, you know, because I have a disease that's out to get me, and I have a disease that's out to tell me that I don't have a disease, and it's lying in wait. And I don't ever want to become complacent about my sobriety again. I have to have surgery in a few weeks, and I was talking to some people at a meeting the other night about the fact that I am scared to death because it's major surgery and I have to be given some pain medication. And a woman pointed out to me who just had half her colon removed that the acronym for SLIP, which is sobriety losing its priority. And I know that one. And I don't ever want that to happen again. I know that as long as I make my sobriety the primary purpose of my life, that I'm going to be okay. And that is why in my workplace, everyone knows that I'm a sober alcoholic. Now, if you're new here, I'm not telling you need to go out and tell the world you're a recovering alcoholic. But for me, I do that. And as a result of doing that, over the last 5 years, 3 of my coworkers have gotten sober and come to Alcoholics Anonymous. When my boss wanted to hire me back to that job and I was getting sober again, I told him the truth about the fact that I had gone out and that I was newly sober and that I couldn't come back to work for him unless I got off work on time every night to go to a meeting. And that because my sobriety was my primary purpose. And today, I try to the best of my ability to do that the same way I did on that first day again. You know, and write that 10-step every morning and do that 11-step and meditate every morning and continue to be of service and continue to work with others, because I know that really all I have is that daily reprieve. And the minute I begin to think that what I do in Alcoholics Anonymous or how many years I have, or, you know, that I'm speaking at this meeting or that I'm, you know, whatever it is, that's when I'm in trouble, you know. And the 12th tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous, the long form of the 12th tradition, talks about humility, and that we ought to practice a genuine humility, this to the end, that our great blessings may never spoil us, that we shall forever live in thankful contemplation of Him who presides over us all. And I never want to forget that the reason I am here tonight is by the grace of God, the fellowship, and the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you all so very much.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.